This content is not suitable for children and may contain depictions of violence.
Hi, I'm your host Cambo. Grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. This is True Crime Island, another true crime podcast. So Islanders, I hope you're all well. Last week, we had the case of the milkshake murderer, Nancy Kissel, who drugged and then bludgeoned to death her husband, Robert Kissel, in their Hong Kong apartment. Now, they had 3 kids and they went to live with their uncle and auntie, Andrew and Hayley Kissel. The thing is, just 2.5 years later, Andrew would be found bound and stabbed to death in the basement of his home. And I said I'd bring you that part of the story this week. So tonight I'll be referencing the Hartford Courant, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Meow.com, and the Cornell Law School, and a couple of photos from Google. Now, as I mentioned last episode, Robert Kissel had done very well in the banking industry and had a rapid rise up through the companies he worked for. He generated a lot of wealth, he was very grounded, and people liked him. Now, on the other hand, his older brother Andrew, born August the 23rd, 1959, well, he was almost the opposite. He chose a life of trying to make fast money any way he could, and if that was illegal or screwed over friends and family, that didn't matter. But that wasn't always the case. At first, he seemed to do the right thing when working for Shearson, Lehman Brothers and W&M Properties Real Estate. They were businesses in New York. Now, it looks like he started to cut corners and go rogue after starting his own real estate business, the Hanrock Group, in 1994. Now, Hanrock was formed from the initials of Hayley, Andrew, Nancy and Robert, who all chipped in to get things started. Now, Andrew married a former ski champion who went on to become a financial analyst, Hayley Wolf. She often appeared on national networks giving financial advice. Now, they would end up with 2 kids. Andrew, when he went out on his own, he would hand out these prospectuses for his, I won't say scam yet, but for his investment opportunities, which listed that he had a bachelor's degree from Boston University and an MBA from New York University. Now, both of these were bullshit. But Andrew, he dressed the part, he spent plenty of money, so he looked very successful and was able to suck investors in. In one instance, he was able to convince investors to join a co-op apartment housing scheme. Now, for those who may not know what these are housing arrangements where you don't actually own the property. Instead, you own shares of a corporation, which in turn owns all of the property in the cooperative. The number of shares that you own corresponds with the size of your apartment. So, if you own 3 large bedrooms, you'll have more shares than the owner of a studio down the hall. So in this case, at the apartment block at 274th Street, East Manhattan, Andrew had 1 unit in the complex, but then he increased that to 2 and then 3. They were adjoining, 2 of them were adjoining, and all of them were adjoining actually, but 2 on one floor and another one was either downstairs or upstairs from the other. He had them all connected to make one multi-level apartment. Now, he ended up becoming treasurer of the co-op and had all correspondence diverted to his own address. All financials would be dealt with on his own and invoices paid with just his signature. He started invoicing the co-op from companies he'd set up himself for work that would never really be done, or when work was done, it was extremely overpriced. All contracts for work were in his possession. Now, he ended up transferring about $4 million into his own accounts before someone noticed. Andrew, in the end, he would agree to pay this money back to avoid a lot of legal action, but where would he get $4 million from, especially at the rate that he spends money? Well, What he would do is get investors to go into buying an apartment complex again. They would all be in a co-op arrangement and he would pay each shareholder a monthly or quarterly dividend. But he would forge the owner's signatures, sell their share in the co-op and keep the money for himself. As long as the investors still got their regular dividend and statements, they were just none the wiser. But ripping off his investors wasn't enough for Andrew Kissel. He wanted more. His other rort was to buy large freestanding houses in well-to-do areas, develop them and flip them. He would hold a mortgage on the property from one bank and then go to another bank with a mortgage paper saying that it had been paid off in full. He would use that as collateral for another mortgage, rinse and repeat. Now, part of his MO was that he'd often change lawyers and banks so that no one would have a sense of what he was really doing. Those investors, like I said before, and the banks, he would pay dividends or the monthly payments so that they weren't suspicious. Plus, as we know, especially in the US, Australia, probably in the UK and Canada as well, banks are willing to lend anyone that looks successful whatever amount they need in the fear of missing out or FOMO and missing out to another bank. So, close scrutiny on Andrew's dealings was just never undertaken, or they didn't get the chance to because he was always changing banks and lawyers. Andrew was into everything. He bought horses, olive oil manufacturing. He was even in the arts where he commissioned a play. He had 30-odd cars and a yacht, but he did want more. Andrew looked on the outside to be extremely successful. Bit of a playboy, and this started to grind on his wife Hayley. You remember how they took in Robert and Nancy's 3 kids? Well, with 2 of her own, Hayley was often left taking care of 5 kids, while Andrew was out dining at fine restaurants and having a great time. He was also rooting plenty of other women. Now, she knew this was going on and the marriage started to break down, especially when he ripped off her father in one of his investment scams. He even forged documents to transfer the Vermont house in Hayley's name to his own name so that he could borrow against it. Now, I won't go into the issue about custody of Robert and Nancy's kids, other than that they were very wealthy, they were worth around $18 million all up, and whoever had custody had a certain amount of control over that money. Now, when Andrew ripped off not only Hayley's father, but also the estate of Robert Kissel, that $18 million, the alarm bells rang within the Kissel family, and there were court cases in regards to custody. Now, Hayley and Andrew ended up with custody of kids right up until the end of this saga. Now, where everything would really start to come undone for Andrew was when he approached a bank for a multi-million-dollar loan. Now, in order to make this a little less confusing, I'll read an extract from an article by Alison Lee Cowan of the New York Times. And it goes, according to Miss Walkley, who at the time was the counsel for Fidelity National's office in Trumbull, Connecticut, she was involved in a June 3 closing which the Fairfield County Bank in Ridgefield, Connecticut, was giving Kissel a $4.5 million construction loan secured by property he owned in Burning Tree Road in Greenwich. A title searcher working for Fidelity National spotted what appeared to be a prior mortgage of $1 million on that property from Independence Community Bank in Brooklyn. Now, asked about it just before the closing, Kissel insisted that the Brooklyn Bank had made an error and meant to record the mortgage on his other property in Greenwich. Now, Miss Walkley said she and her team took that to mean his residence on Dairy Road in Greenwich. When they later learned that he only rents that house and doesn't own it, she said they were concerned, but they were not sure that Kissel had lied. What do you mean, not sure he lied? He either owns it or he doesn't, and he knows that very well. Anyway, let's go on. Also, because Kissel had already drawn down funds from the Ridgefield Bank's construction loan by the time the confusion began, Miss Walkley said she thought it best to record the new mortgage while they sorted it out. The following Monday, Miss Walkley was relieved when Mr. Kissel, as promised, furnished a notarized document that appeared to be from the Brooklyn Bank releasing its $1 million claim on the Burning Tree Road property. Now, had her company not been enlisted 2 weeks later to ensure another Kissel deal, Miss Walkley said she's not sure she would have made the connections that she would make. In that second deal, Kissel wanted to borrow $6.42 million from Countrywide Commercial Real Estate Finance Incorporated in California against the apartment complex in Woodbury. This time, one of Fidelity National's title searchers found a prior mortgage on the property for $5.4 million from Astoria Federal Savings in New York. Holding his ground, Mr. Kissel forwarded a release that showed Astoria Federal relinquished its claim on the property back in March. With Mr. Kissel expected to be out of the country, a power of attorney arrived on Miss Walkley's desk on June the 17th, allowing the closing to proceed without him. Now, one look at the loops in his signature made her nauseated, she said, because it resembled the signature of a bank official that appeared on the Astoria Federal release. Her apprehension grew. She said that when she realised that at the end of the day I was going to be writing Mr. Kissel's account for $6 million, she was starting to freak out. Now, a colleague at Federal National encouraged Miss Walkley to call Astoria Federal to ease her mind. To her shock, the bank told her that Kissel was current on his loan and had an outstanding balance of $5.3 million. Next thing she knew, she was calling her client, the California bank, to explain why the closing was not going to happen. Now, 6 weeks later, federal agents were knocking on the door of Kissel's Vermont vacation home. So, how many banks did I mention then? And how many? There's a couple of properties there. But basically, what he's doing, he's getting a property. He owes millions on it. He forges the document saying that the mortgage is clear and fully paid off. He then uses that property to get money from another bank, and we're talking a week later or so, and he just keeps doing it. Now, the fact that she happened, just by coincidence, to be involved in 2 of these deals back to back, she started to see, hey, hang on, that signature there of Andrews, the big loopy A, that looks exactly the same as this bank official's. So she picked up on this. It was just very clever of her. And FBI gets involved. Kissel gets arrested. Now, the FBI, they would end up finding a trail of dodgy deals worth at least 30 to 40 million in fraudulent loans and 24 million in other fraudulent activity. Now, when Haley, his wife, found out about this, she was not impressed. She confided in a friend that not only did she want a divorce, but she wanted Andrew dead. She even told Andrew's sister Jane that, God, I hate your brother. I could actually see myself pummeling him to death and just enjoying the sensation. Now, Jane, that was Andrew and Robert's sister. Now, she had been a ski student of Haley's, and that's how Andrew met her. And Jane and Haley, they were very close friends. So Haley would often vent her frustrations about her brother to Jane. Now, Haley filed for divorce in February 2006, stating that Andrew was a belligerent alcoholic and he was taking too much coke. With all of Andrew's bank accounts frozen, he couldn't even pay the rent on the Greenwich mansion. The landlord initiated legal proceedings for unpaid rent and they were evicted. Now, there was an arrangement between Haley and Jane to hand over Robert and Nancy's kids to her. But Haley would renege on this agreement, as now she was financially pretty much up shit creek without a paddle and nowhere to live. Now, the trust money coming in for her looking after the kids would give her a place to live. Now, look, she did come from a wealthy family, so really she wasn't homeless. She was pretty much okay. She could have found a place to live. But trying to get a job like she had before, it was a high-profile job on Tejan, with this scandal, well, it wasn't really going to be a good look. So she held on to the kids and the money that went with them. By this time, Haley had to leave the Greenwich mansion, and so the movers came and moved most of her stuff to a new place by the 1st of April. Now, she did leave enough furniture for Andrew to sleep comfortably, so I guess a bed and some clothes. Now, Andrew stayed at this Greenwich place on the night of April the 2nd alone. The high-flying real estate guru was now friendless, wifeless, and all alone with a tracking bracelet on his ankle. Being a bit of an arsehole, once the money was gone, so were all of his friends. Except his faithful chauffeur, 49-year-old Carlos Trujillo. Now, Carlos had worked for Andrew for quite some time. Now, he'd immigrated from Colombia and had established himself with lots of other members of his family in the US of A. He was more of a gopher than a straight-out chauffeur, bringing Andrew whatever he asked for, like Uber Eats, but this guy could bring him Coke as well. Now, he knew more about Andrew's dealings and affairs than his wife. On the afternoon of the 2nd, Carlos delivered food to Andrew at the Greenwich house at around 6 p.m. Now, this would be the last known person to see Andrew alive. The next morning at around 6 a.m, movers turned up to remove the last of Kissel's possessions from the house. In the basement, they would find Andrew Kissel, bound by his hand and feet with cable ties, blindfolded and gagged, lying in a pool of blood. He'd been stabbed 5 times and one wound was in the jugular vein. Police were called and a crime scene established. There was no sign of forced entry. Now, in true crime, we all know this indicates that Andrew probably knew his killers. The problem for police was that Andrew had fucked over so many people, including family and friends, that there was no clear suspect. He had signed a plea deal over his dodgy dealings the previous year, and only 5 days after he was killed, this was when he was supposed to plead guilty to bank and mail fraud in court. When Hayley heard about the death, she called Carlos to pick up the family dog and bring it to her place. I mean, that's cold. Was it someone who didn't want him to go to court, who may have been implemented in Andrew's fraudulent activity? Was it a pissed off investor who wanted him dead? Now, Hayley, who had confided in a friend that she wanted Andrew dead, was high on the list, but she would eventually be cleared. There was even a theory that Andrew, not wanting to face a lengthy prison sentence and poverty, hired someone to kill him so his family would be able to claim on his life insurance. Now, even though he was in divorce proceedings with Hayley, I think he thought this would be the best outcome, at least for the kids. Now, Carlos, being the last person to see Andrew alive, was also investigated and police would end up making him a prime suspect. You see, Carlos had been helping Andrew hide money and assets in the months before his death. It was reported that he laundered and helped hide $375,000 or more of assets and cash for Andrew in the months up to his death. But why would Carlos kill him? Well, apparently a large proportion, if not all of that money, wasn't returned to Andrew and Carlos kept it. Now, there's also Jorge Trujillo, a property manager for Andrew and his legal wife, Stella Tarfer. Now, Stella was bookkeeper for Andrew. Now, I say legal wife because apparently she was actually shacked up with big bro Carlos. Anyway, Jorge took off back to Colombia just before Andrew's death, allegedly with $200,000 cash from Andrew's safe. Now, Hayley knew this money was in there and she wasn't impressed when she found it gone. Anyway, what kept investigators looking at Carlos was the fact that he changed his story of where he was after he last saw Andrew. He changed it several times. The investigation into Carlos would take years and eventually include a couple of his relos, 24-year-old Lenny Trujillo and Jair Trujillo. Now, a search of Carlos's place would uncover a credit card belonging to an Aminta Trujillo. When they went to track down this Aminta woman, they eventually found her in Waterbury, which is about 77 miles or 125 kilometres northeast of New York City. When detectives spoke to her, she thought they were there to talk to her about her family's involvement with drug cartels. When the detective told her it was about a homicide, she replied, they killed the rich Jew guy. So she's basically put her relos right in the shit. Now, investigators finally had a break in the case. She told them how Lenny had been hired by Carlos to kill Andrew Kissel. So they brought him in. And it wouldn't be long before Lenny would spill the beans. He would tell investigators that he was approached by Carlos to kill Andrew Kissel for $11,000 and a computer. However, he had no intentions of actually killing him and that he did help plan the murder, but he only took the money and didn't go through with it. Okay, so now not only do they have Aminta saying that Carlos was involved, but now they have one of his co-conspirators to the slaying, who's admitted it. Further investigations would reveal that for the few months before Andrew was killed, there were 50-odd phone and text messages between Carlos and Lenny, whereas before that time, there was none, because these guys weren't close at all. Also, Lenny had used his credit card to buy cable ties and I think gloves before the murder. The cable ties that Lenny described, they were only known about by the killer. It hadn't been released in the media that cable ties had been used. Now, there were also travel documents and room receipts showing Lenny was in the area at the time of the murder. Now, as I mentioned before, there were no signs of forced entry into Andrew's house, and the crime scene was reasonably clean. Andrew was bound, gagged, and his t-shirt pulled over his head when he was found, and this indicates that the killer was close to the victim. Maybe Andrew pleaded with Carlos and Lenny not to kill him, and they couldn't bear looking at him and hearing his screams for help. And there was no reason to gag him, as he was in the basement of a mansion on a large lot of land. No one would be able to hear the screams from another property. Now, I did check this property out on Google Earth, because Google Maps, the house doesn't exist anymore. They've actually put a new house up in 2007. But if you have a look down, there's just big mansions on sprawling estates. So there's no way, even if you're screaming on the top of your lungs, anyone from next door would be able to hear you, let alone if you're in the basement. Now, Lenny would do a deal with prosecutors in exchange for giving evidence against Carlos. Lenny would plead guilty to manslaughter and conspiracy to commit murder, and he would get 20 years for his involvement. That's not a short time for doing a deal, and that will be important a bit later on. Now, Carlos was charged with murder and attempted murder. The prosecution put forward the motive that Carlos had laundered all this money for Andrew and was worried he might get found out if Andrew went to trial, so he enlisted his cousin to kill him. The defence argued that Lenny's story was just that, a story that was made up after he was pressured by investigators. But why would you accept a 20-year deal if it was untrue? So I'm putting my money on it probably was true what Lenny had to say. At Carlos's trial, he would be acquitted of murder, but there was a hung jury on the attempted murder charge. However, the prosecution wanted a retrial. In the end, Carlos would strike an offered plea with prosecutors, and he ended up just getting 6 years. Now, an offered plea is a guilty plea in criminal court whereby a defendant in a criminal case does not admit to the criminal act and asserts innocence. In entering an offered plea, the defendant admits that the evidence presented by the prosecution would be likely to persuade a judge or jury to find the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the name Alford plea is taken from North Carolina v. Alford, 400 US 25 or 25. So you can look that up in Google if you like. So, Islanders, what a tangled web of bullshit this case was. Robert's murder last week, in the episode last week, was crazy, but this one's pretty much messed up as well. Andrew, trying to keep up his high-flying lifestyle, starts ripping people off and committing fraud. He didn't care if it was family or friends. He did anything to get money. At first, he was able to cover his tracks by making sure everyone involved would get their regular dividends or banks would get payments, and he kept a distance from a lot of the transactions by using power of attorney documents so others could sign off on his deals. The banks were as much to blame. Look, they were desperate to get Andrew's business and didn't do enough due diligence. So as with any of these rob Peter to pay Paul Ponzi schemes, they will eventually come crashing down. And it did. With all his friends and family gone, all his cars and boats gone, with the prospect of going to jail for a long time, Andrew Kissel, once a socialite, a womanizer, real estate guru and wealthy man, he died alone in the basement of a rented house he'd been evicted from. I mean, what a fall from grace. So, what do you think? Did Andrew get Carlos to kill him in order for his life insurance policy to be paid out to his family? And by the way, apparently it wasn't, because the insurance company argued that Andrew's cocaine habit hadn't been declared. Now, did his wife Hayley order a hit? Or was it maybe many of the people he'd ripped off over the years? Did they get the hit out on him? My thoughts, well, I think Carlos kept all the money and other assets that Andrew had given him to liquidate and hide from the FBI and creditors. He knew that there would come a time when Andrew wanted it back, so it was easier to bump him off than risk giving it back, and then maybe he might have done time for laundering the money for him. Now, Jorge Trejo, he'd already run off apparently, allegedly, with $200,000 cash, so Carlos is probably going, hey, after all the years of service I've done, I need my cut as well. Now, Lenny probably was involved, but may have chickened out. I'm thinking he might have been the one who was supposed to organise maybe a gun. And when he backed out of the deal, Carlos didn't have a gun, so he used a knife to kill Andrew. Suicide for hire, maybe, but if Andrew did want Carlos to kill him so his wife could claim the insurance, he probably would have wanted it to be shot in the head rather than getting knifed and bleeding out all over the floor. But the narcissist that Andrew was, I don't really think he would have asked to have himself killed. Okay, well that's about it for this week, the end of another episode. If you want to support the island, there's links in the description to Patreon, PayPal and merch. Please feel free to comment, like, subscribe, and I would truly appreciate if you share the channel. Hit the bell to be notified. Because I don't bleep out swearing words and, I'm always talking about murder and stuff, the YouTube gods won't promote the channel, so your subscription and sharing are really appreciated in getting more people on the island. And the island, I'm the only one here actually running this show, so that's about it. I've been your host, Cambo. You've been watching True Crime Island, and as I always say, don't forget to delete your browser history. Good night. Boom fuckalunga.